Late 1943, high above occupied Europe. American bomber formations were flying deeper into German-controlled territory than ever before, but every mission carried the same problem. Once the escort fighters turned back due to fuel limits, the bombers were left alone in hostile skies. German Luftwaffe pilots had built their interception tactics around this reality. They knew that if they waited long enough, the escorts would eventually disappear, leaving the heavy bombers exposed. For years, this assumption had shaped the air war over Europe. American B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators could fly enormous distances, but the fighters meant to protect them simply could not stay with them all the way to Germany's most important targets. The result was predictable. The German fighters would climb to meet the bombers after the escorts turned back, attacking in coordinated formations designed to break apart the bomber groups before they could reach their targets. Losses were heavy, and both sides understood the stakes. If Allied bombers could not reach deep industrial centers inside Germany, the strategic bombing campaign would remain limited. But if the bombers could strike the heart of German industry consistently, the pressure on the German war machine would increase dramatically. For German pilots watching the skies over the Reich, the pattern had become familiar. Escort fighters appeared over Western Europe, stayed with the bombers for part of the journey, and then eventually disappeared as fuel gauges forced them to turn for home. Early in 1944, that familiar pattern began to break. The bomber formations approaching Germany were still surrounded by fighter escorts, but now those fighters were not turning back. Instead, German radar operators and Luftwaffe pilots began encountering a new escort fighter over central Germany and even near Berlin itself. The aircraft was the P-51 Mustang, a sleek American fighter powered by a Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and equipped with external fuel tanks that dramatically extended its range. At first glance, many German pilots assumed it was simply another Allied fighter joining the growing air war over Europe. But the difference quickly became obvious. The Mustang could travel far deeper into German territory than earlier escort fighters, and it could remain with the bombers during the most dangerous phases of the mission. Instead of waiting for Allied escorts to disappear, the German interceptors were now meeting well-armed American fighters directly above the bomber streams. Missions that once depended on attacking unprotected bombers were suddenly turning into large-scale fighter battles over Germany itself. As more Mustangs appeared over the Reich, Luftwaffe pilots began to realize that something fundamental had changed. The Allies had finally introduced a fighter capable of escorting bombers all the way to their targets, and sometimes even beyond them. The skies over Germany were no longer the safe hunting ground they had once been. For much of 1943, German air defense planning rested on a simple assumption. Allied bombers could not reach the deepest parts of Germany while remaining fully protected by fighter escorts. American B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators had the range to cross occupied Europe and strike major industrial centers, but the fighters assigned to protect them did not. Early escort fighters, such as the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning, could accompany bomber formations for part of the journey, but fuel limitations forced them to turn back long before the bombers reached their most dangerous targets. German commanders understood this weakness and built their interception strategy around it. Radar networks across occupied Europe tracked incoming bomber formations. DAR and Luftwaffe fighter units waited for the moment when the escorts disappeared from the sky. Once that moment arrived, German interceptors climbed into position and attacked the bomber streams in coordinated waves. Pilots flying aircraft like the Messerschmitt B, F-109 and the Focke-Wulf FW-190 were trained to strike from multiple angles, firing concentrated bursts into the bomber formations before breaking away to regroup. The method relied on discipline, timing, and the knowledge that the bombers would eventually be alone. From the German perspective, this system had worked repeatedly. Even heavily armed bomber formations could suffer serious losses when attacked by experienced interceptors. The Luftwaffe believed that as long as the escorts could not remain with the bombers for the entire mission, then the strategic bombing campaign would always carry severe risks for the attackers. This belief influenced not only tactics, but also the broader German view of the air war. Luftwaffe planners expected that the Allies would continue sending large bomber formations into Germany, but they assumed those missions would remain costly and difficult. German fighter groups were stationed near major industrial regions specifically to intercept bombers after their escorts turned away. When radar stations detected incoming bomber formations, fighters could be directed to the most vulnerable point in the mission profile. Usually, the moment when the bombers approached German territory without fighter protection. Pilots preparing for these interceptions often expected the same pattern they had seen many times before. Bombers flying in tight formations, defensive guns firing in every direction, but no escort fighters nearby once the mission reached its deepest phase. As long as that pattern continued, German commanders believed the Luftwaffe could still contest the skies over the Reich. But that assumption depended entirely on the limits of Allied fighter range. If a fighter appeared that could travel as far as the bombers themselves, the entire system would be disrupted. German planners did not yet fully realize how quickly that possibility was becoming reality. When the captured B-24 was finally moved to a secure airfield for examination, German engineers and aviation specialists began studying the aircraft with intense curiosity. For them, this was a rare opportunity. Normally, the bombers they encountered in combat were either destroyed in midair or crashed in such a way that much of the structure was damaged beyond useful analysis. But this aircraft, though not perfectly intact, still contained enough of its structure to reveal how the Americans had designed and built one of their most important bombers. The inspection began with the most visible components of the aircraft. Engineers walked around the bomber slowly, examining the fuselage, wings, landing gear, and engine nacelles. They carefully measured the wingspan and studied the unusual shape of the aircraft's wing design. Compared to many European bombers, the B-24 had a long, narrow wing that looked very different from the broader wing shapes commonly used in German aircraft. Inside the aircraft, the engineers examined the cockpit and the arrangement of instruments and controls. They noted how the pilot and co-pilot positions were arranged and how the flight systems were organized. Every switch, cable, and mechanical linkage was carefully observed. Even small design decisions could reveal important ideas about how American engineers approached aircraft construction. Moving further into the aircraft, they studied the bomb bay located within the fuselage. The B-24 was designed to carry a heavy load of bombs while still maintaining the range needed for long missions. Engineers looked closely at the structural supports that allowed the aircraft to carry this weight without compromising its ability to fly safely over long distances. The defensive gun positions attracted particular attention. The bomber carried multiple machine gun turrets positioned around the aircraft to defend against fighter attacks. German engineers inspected these turrets carefully, examining how they rotated, how the gunners were protected, and how ammunition was fed into the weapons. They understood that bomber formations relied heavily on defensive firepower to protect themselves from interception. But, as the inspection continued, something else began to stand out. The aircraft's construction revealed a pattern that engineers found both impressive and surprising. Many sections of the aircraft appeared to be built in ways that suggested they could be manufactured separately and assembled later. Panels, internal structures, and mechanical components were arranged with a kind of practical efficiency that hinted at something beyond the aircraft itself. The B-24 was not just designed to fly well. It was designed to be built quickly, and the more the engineers examined the aircraft, the more they began realizing that the real secret of the bomber might not lie in its weapons or engines, but in the way it had been manufactured. The first clear proof of what the P-51 Mustang could do came as the aircraft began appearing in large numbers during Allied bomber missions over Germany in early 1944. Until then, German fighter pilots had grown used to a predictable pattern. Allied bomber formations would cross occupied Europe with escort fighters nearby, but eventually, those escorts would turn back once their fuel ran low. Luftwaffe interceptors often waited for that moment. Once the escorts disappeared, German fighters would move in to attack the heavy bombers, relying on coordinated tactics designed to break up the formations and inflict maximum damage. But when Mustang squadrons began escorting the bombers, the pattern started to change. German radar stations tracking incoming Allied aircraft began reporting escort fighters appearing much farther east than before. Instead of encountering unprotected bomber formations near Germany's industrial centers, Luftwaffe pilots increasingly found themselves facing Allied fighters that had stayed with the bombers throughout the journey. For the first time in the strategic bombing campaign, German interceptors were meeting escort fighters, not only near the edges of occupied Europe, but also over the Reich itself. Mustang pilots flying with the bomber streams began engaging German fighters during the exact moments when interceptors expected to find only bombers. This forced the Luftwaffe to fight for control of the skies in areas where they once believed they had a tactical advantage. These early encounters demonstrated that the Mustang was not simply extending escort coverage slightly farther into Europe. It was fundamentally changing the geography of the air war. During major bombing operations against German targets, escort fighters could now accompany the bomber formations across most of the mission route. When German fighters climbed to intercept the bombers, they often discovered that Allied fighters were already present and ready to engage them. Instead of attacking bombers in relatively controlled conditions, Luftwaffe pilots had to fight through escort fighters before they could even reach the bomber formations. In many cases, Mustang squadrons would position themselves above or ahead of the bombers, forcing German interceptors into immediate combat as they approached. This changed the rhythm of interception missions. The German pilots who once expected to strike the bombers directly now found themselves drawn into fighter battles before they could carry out their planned attacks. The impact of this shift became clearer with each mission. As more Mustangs joined the escort forces, the Luftwaffe faced a growing challenge in reaching the bombers at all. The skies over Germany were no longer simply a defensive battlefield for German fighters. They were becoming a contested airspace where Allied fighters could meet them head-on. For the pilots flying these escort missions, the arrival of the P-51 Mustang did more than change strategy on paper. It changed what daily combat felt like in the air. American fighter pilots assigned to long-range escort duties quickly realized they were now participating in a different kind of mission than earlier escort groups had experienced. Instead of turning back halfway across Europe, Mustang pilots could remain with the bomber formations as they pushed deeper into German airspace. This meant that the most dangerous part of the mission, the moment when German fighters attempted to break up the bomber streams, often happened while escort fighters were still present and ready to engage. Pilots flying with the 8th Air Force described missions that lasted for hours, crossing the English Channel, moving over occupied Europe, and eventually entering the heavily defended skies above Germany itself. During these long flights, the bomber formations stretched across miles of sky, their engines forming a constant mechanical roar that could be heard even above the wind and propeller noise inside a fighter cockpit. Mustang pilots had to watch the bomber formations carefully, while also scanning the horizon for German interceptors climbing toward the bombers. Combat could begin at almost any moment, and once German fighters appeared, the escort pilots were responsible for intercepting them before they could reach the bombers. One of the pilots who experienced this shift firsthand was Bud Anderson, a Mustang pilot who flew numerous escort missions with the 8th Air Force. Like many other fighter pilots of the time, Anderson understood that the success of these missions depended not only on the performance of the aircraft, but also on coordination between the bombers and their escorts. Mustang pilots often positioned themselves slightly above the bomber formations so they could dive toward German fighters approaching from below or from the sides. From this vantage point, they could see the bomber formations stretching across the sky, while also watching for the small shapes of German fighters climbing to intercept. When combat began, the skies above Germany could quickly fill with aircraft maneuvering at high speed. Mustang pilots attempted to disrupt German interception attacks before the bombers came under heavy fire. At the same time, they had to remain aware of their fuel levels and the long journey back across Europe once the bombing mission was complete. For the men flying these aircraft, the P-51 Mustang represented more than a new fighter. It represented the ability to stay with the bombers when they needed protection the most. That change altered the experience of both the bomber crews and the escort pilots who accompanied them across the skies of Europe. As the P-51 Mustang became more common in the skies over Europe, its impact began to extend beyond simply escorting bomber formations. The presence of long-range fighters allowed Allied air commanders to rethink how escort aircraft could be used during bombing missions. Previously, escort fighters had focused almost entirely on staying close to the bomber formations, defending them from interceptors that attempted to break through the defensive gun formations. With the arrival of the Mustang and its extended range, that rigid defensive role began to change. Escort fighters could now operate with greater flexibility across the entire mission route. Some Mustang squadrons remained near the bomber formations to protect them directly, while others moved ahead of the bombers or patrolled areas where German fighters were expected to assemble. This approach meant that Allied fighters could actively search for Luftwaffe aircraft before they even reached the bombers. Instead of waiting for German interceptors to attack, Mustang pilots could disrupt those interceptions before they fully developed. The long-range escort fighter had effectively turned what had once been a defensive mission into an increasingly offensive one. Allied fighter units began targeting German aircraft as they climbed from their airfields or assembled for interception, forcing the Luftwaffe to fight earlier in the mission than it had originally planned. This wider shift gradually placed increasing pressure on German fighter units responsible for defending the Reich. The Luftwaffe pilots preparing to intercept bomber formations could no longer assume they would encounter unprotected bombers at a predictable point in the mission. Instead, German fighters often found themselves meeting Allied escort fighters long before reaching the bomber formations. This forced them to fight through the escorts first, expending fuel, time, and energy before even attempting to attack the bombers themselves. The change affected the entire rhythm of the air defense system. Radar operators might still detect incoming bomber formations, and interceptor units could still scramble to meet them. But the outcome of those interceptions was becoming less certain. The escort fighters patrolling ahead of the bomber streams could disrupt carefully planned German attacks or force interceptors into defensive maneuvers before they reached their intended targets. Over time, these encounters gradually reduced the Luftwaffe's ability to mount large, coordinated interception attacks against bomber formations. The Mustang did not win the air war by itself, but it helped create conditions in which German fighter units were increasingly forced to react rather than control the battle. By 1944, the impact of the P-51 Mustang was no longer limited to individual missions or isolated fighter encounters. The aircraft was now appearing in growing numbers across the Allied air forces operating over Europe, and its presence was supported by an industrial system capable of producing fighters at an enormous scale. American factories were delivering hundreds of Mustangs every month, and new squadrons equipped with the aircraft were joining combat operations alongside the 8th Air Force and other Allied air units. This steady flow of aircraft meant that the long-range escort concept was not a temporary advantage, but a capability that could expand rapidly. Bomber missions that once depended on a limited number of escort fighters could now be supported by larger groups of long-range aircraft capable of remaining with the bombers throughout most of the mission. As production continued to rise, Mustang units were assigned to escort duties across a wide range of operations, from strikes against German aircraft factories to missions targeting transportation networks and fuel facilities. The growing number of escort fighters meant that bomber formations could travel across Europe with increasingly consistent protection. German pilots encountering these missions began to notice that Allied fighters were no longer appearing in small groups, but often in significant numbers accompanying the bombers. At the same time, the Mustang benefited from a larger system that allowed it to operate effectively across long distances. The aircraft's range depended not only on its design, but also on the logistical support that sustained Allied air operations. Fuel supplies, maintenance crews, trained pilots, and the network of airfields across Britain all contributed to the ability of Mustang squadrons to maintain continuous operations. When bomber formations took off for missions into Germany, escort fighters could be launched in coordinated waves designed to accompany them along different segments of the route. This coordination ensured that bombers remained protected even during extremely long missions. For the Luftwaffe, the growing scale of these operations created an increasingly difficult situation. While German fighter units now faced not only the bomber formations themselves, but also a steadily increasing number of escort fighters capable of challenging them throughout the mission. As more Mustangs appeared in the skies over Europe, German pilots were forced to adapt to a battlefield where Allied fighters were present in greater numbers and over a wider area than before. The scale of these operations made it increasingly difficult for the Luftwaffe to concentrate its forces effectively against the bombers. As the months of 1944 passed, German fighter pilots and commanders gradually began to understand the full implications of the long-range escort problem. At first, the appearance of the P-51 Mustang had been treated as another incremental improvement in Allied fighter capability. The Luftwaffe had faced new Allied aircraft before, and had usually adapted by adjusting tactics or concentrating interceptors at critical points along the bomber routes. But the Mustang introduced a challenge that was not easily solved through tactical adjustments alone. The fundamental advantage that German interceptors had relied upon, the moment when Allied escorts were forced to turn back, was disappearing. Bomber formations that once arrived over German territory alone were now accompanied by fighters capable of remaining with them deep into the Reich. This meant that German pilots attempting to intercept the bombers were increasingly forced to fight through escort fighters before reaching their intended targets. Even when interception attacks were launched successfully, the presence of escort fighters often disrupted the carefully coordinated attacks that had previously allowed German units to inflict heavy losses on bomber formations. The skies over Germany were becoming more crowded, more contested, and more dangerous for the defenders. Reports from Luftwaffe units began to reflect this growing difficulty. Pilots returning from interception missions described encounters with Allied fighters, appearing in places where earlier missions had encountered none. Instead of facing only defensive gunfire from the bomber formations, German fighters were now engaged by escort aircraft maneuvering aggressively to prevent attacks on the bombers. These encounters forced the Luftwaffe to devote more of its limited resources to fighting escort fighters, rather than focusing entirely on the bomber formations themselves. German planners still attempted to organize large interception efforts, but these operations increasingly faced resistance from Allied fighters already positioned along the bomber routes. Over time, this pattern made it harder for German air defenses to inflict the kind of losses that had once threatened the strategic bombing campaign. The realization came gradually, rather than all at once. The P-51 Mustang was not the only factor shaping the air war, but its presence represented a clear sign that the Allies had solved one of the most difficult problems in long-range bombing operations. The bombers could now reach Germany with protection that had once been impossible. The arrival of the P-51 Mustang did not single-handedly decide the air war over Europe, but it played a significant role in reshaping the balance between Allied bombers and German air defenses. By solving the problem of long-range fighter escort, The Mustang allowed bomber formations to strike targets deep inside Germany, with far more consistent protection than before. Strategic bombing missions that had once faced the greatest danger near their targets could now rely on escort fighters throughout much of the journey. This reduced the opportunities for German interceptors to attack isolated bomber formations and forced the Luftwaffe to fight under increasingly difficult conditions. The impact was cumulative rather than immediate. Each mission that reached German industrial regions with escort fighters added pressure on factories, transportation networks, and fuel production facilities that were already under strain from years of war. At the same time, the presence of Allied fighters over Germany placed additional demands on Luftwaffe units tasked with defending the Reich. German pilots who once focused primarily on attacking bombers now had to contend with escort fighters capable of challenging them directly. Over time, this shift contributed to a broader change in the air war. Allied air forces gained greater freedom to operate over Europe, while German fighter units faced growing difficulty in organizing large, coordinated interception attacks. The long-range escort provided by the P-51 Mustang made it harder for the Luftwaffe to isolate bomber formations and easier for Allied fighters to contest control of the skies above Germany. Combined with the scale of American aircraft production and the expanding network of Allied airfields across Britain and continental Europe, the Mustang helped create conditions in which the strategic bombing campaign could operate with increasing effectiveness. The aircraft itself was only one element in a much larger system that included bomber forces, industrial production, trained pilots, and logistical support. Yet within that system, the P-51 Mustang represented the closing of a critical gap that had once limited the reach of Allied air power. When escort fighters could travel as far as the bombers they protected, the air war over Europe entered a new phase, one in which the skies over Germany were no longer controlled by the defenders alone. The P-51 Mustang did not win the air war alone, but it closed the distance that once protected Germany's skies. When long-range escorts finally reached Berlin, the strategic bombing campaign entered a new phase. From that point forward, the Luftwaffe was no longer fighting bombers alone. It was fighting the fighters that came with them.